Let me tell you something about the word surprise. In America, surprise is a category that contains things that are unexpected, things that arrive without announcement, and that require a response you had not prepared, because the preparation assumes the announcement, and the announcement did not come. Surprise is the gap between what you expected and what actually arrived. The size of the surprise is the size of the gap. 6 weeks after my wedding, Nane Beth moved into my house. The surprise was not that she moved in. The surprise was the size of the gap between what I understood about what I had married into and what I actually understood about what I had married into. And the gap, it turned out, was large enough to park a life inside. Which is approximately what happened when her mother arrived at my door on a Wednesday morning in January with 2 bags and a plastic container of something she had cooked the night before, and the specific expression of a woman who has made a decision about where she is going and does not require confirmation that the decision is welcome. I want to tell you what I did. I will. But I need to tell you who I was when the 2 bags arrived at the door, and what the 2 bags meant in the context of a man who had spent 61 years in a particular understanding of what the space inside a house was for, and who was about to have that understanding revised by a 67-year-old woman from the province of Cebu who could cook adobo that made everything I had ever called adobo seem like a description of adobo rather than the thing itself. My name is Joe. I am 63 now, which means I was 61 when I married Grace, and 61 and 6 weeks when Nane Beth arrived with the 2 bags and the container. I spent 29 years as a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon, which is a profession that produces, over 3 decades, a specific set of characteristics that I will describe as follows. You become someone who understands context. Not just the context of events, but the context of people. The accumulated circumstances that explain why a person does what they do in the moment they do it. The historical causation that makes the present legible if you know how to read it. You become someone who knows that you cannot understand the event without understanding what came before the event. And you know this so well and so deeply that it becomes the way you think about everything, including, eventually, yourself. I understood this about other people for 29 years and applied it imperfectly to myself, and not at all, until the Wednesday in January, to the woman I had married, and her mother, and the specific architecture of what I had walked into when I said yes in a church in Cebu on a Saturday in November with Nane Beth in the front pew, and Grace beside me, and the priest asking the question that produces the yes, that produces the rest of it. Let me tell you about Grace first. Not the full account, because Grace deserves her own story, and this is a story about her mother and what her mother's arrival did to me. But enough. Enough of Grace, so that you understand what I had found before I tell you what arrived to complicate the finding. I had been in Cebu for 14 months when I met her. I had come from Portland at 60, for the reasons that men like me come to the Philippines at 60. The pension that went further here than it went there, the specifically beautiful quality of a Philippine morning that makes every Oregon morning seem like a draft, the sense that the second half of a life deserved to be inhabited rather than administered. I had been divorced once, briefly, at 42, from a woman named Patricia, whose main complaint about the marriage was that I was married to the job first, and to her a distant second, which was accurate, and which I had been unable to address at the time, because addressing it would have required me to admit it, and I was not ready to admit things about myself at 42 that I became ready to admit at 55, when Patricia was long gone, and the time for admitting had passed its useful window. I met Grace at a cooking class. I want to say that without apology, because cooking classes in the Philippines are not the recreational cooking classes of American cities. The ones where people who already know how to cook go to drink wine and learn a recipe they will make once. They are instruction. Real, practical, specific instruction, delivered by people who have been cooking for 40 years, and who have decided that the knowledge is worth passing on, and that passing it on is worth the teaching. I signed up because I was 60 and alone, and I was eating at Carinderias every day, which was fine for the lunch, but insufficient for the evenings, and I wanted to learn to cook the food I had been eating, and the class was the way to learn it. Grace was in the class for professional reasons. She ran a small catering operation, 5 years old at the time I met her, that she had built from a single oven and a talent for the specific dishes that Filipino celebrations required, the lechon and the kare-kare and the pancit that had to be made correctly, which meant made the way the grandmother made it, which meant made with the attention and the patience that mass production cannot provide, and that Grace provided at the scale that small catering provides it. She was in the class because a new dish had entered the regional celebrations, and she wanted to know how to make it correctly before she offered it. She was 39. She sat next to me because the class was arranged by tables, and we were assigned to the same table, and the assignment was the universe making a decision without consulting either of us, which is the way the universe tends to make its best decisions. She tasted something I had made and said, in the direct English of someone who learned it in a school that valued precision, "You used too much vinegar." I said I thought it was the right amount. She said, "It is not the right amount. The right amount is when you cannot taste the vinegar specifically, but you can taste what the vinegar does to everything around it." She tasted it again. "You can taste the vinegar, specifically." She was right. I made it again with less vinegar. She tasted it. She said, "Better." You learn quickly. That was the beginning. 14 months later, we were married. I want to tell you about the courtship in the specific details that make it real, rather than the broad strokes that make it a story. She brought Jasmine to meet me in the 3rd month. Her daughter from a previous relationship who was 13, and who had her mother's directness delivered at the volume of someone who had not yet learned to calibrate it, which is to say, at full volume, all the time, without prefacing remarks. Jasmine said I was very tall, which was accurate. She said my Cebuano pronunciation was the worst she had heard in her life, which was also accurate. She said she would teach me if I wanted to learn correctly, which she subsequently did, with the pedagogical authority of a teenager who has decided to take a project seriously and who does not permit the project to slack. I became acceptable to Jasmine by month 4. I know this because she stopped pointing out errors of pronunciation and began competing with me at the word games she played on her phone, which is a different register of relationship entirely. Grace's family. I need to tell you about the family before I tell you about Nane Beth arriving, because Nane Beth arriving makes no sense without the family, and the family makes no sense without a man understanding what Filipino families actually are, rather than what he thinks they are, from 14 months of living adjacent to them rather than inside one. I thought I understood. I want to say that with the honesty it deserves. I had been in Cebu for 14 months. I had eaten at Carinderias, and walked the boulevard and attended 2 fiestas, and learned enough Cebuano to navigate a market, and I had a Filipino girlfriend whom I was going to marry, and I thought I understood the structure of what I was joining, because I had been paying attention for 14 months, and paying attention was what I had done professionally for 29 years, and the paying attention had produced, I believed, an understanding that was adequate to the situation. This belief was the central error of the first 6 weeks of my marriage. Nanay Beth was Grace's mother, 67 years old. A woman who had grown up in the province north of Cebu, in a house with 7 siblings and parents, who farmed, and who understood the world in the specific terms of people who have grown things in soil, and waited for rain, and understood that patience and provision were the 2 primary human activities, and that all others were secondary to these 2. She had cooked for her 7 siblings and her parents, and later for her husband and her 3 children, and later for the catering company her daughter Grace had built, and whose early events Nanay Beth had helped staff, in the years when the company was 1 oven and a talent, and the labor had to come from somewhere, And the somewhere was family, because family was the available labor, when the money for hired labor had not arrived yet. She was formidable in the way of women who have been feeding people for 50 years, and who have developed, through the feeding, an authority over kitchens that extends into a more general authority over spaces where kitchens exist, which is to say homes. She moved through a house with the confidence of someone who understands that the kitchen is the center, and the rest of the house is organized around the center, and whose relationship to any kitchen she entered was therefore a relationship to the center of the space, rather than a room within it. She approved of me. I want to say that because it matters to the story, and because approval from Nane Beth was not a thing she distributed casually. She had looked at me at the engagement dinner with the assessment she applied to all significant ingredients, which was the assessment of someone who understood quality and who was deciding whether what was in front of her was the right quality for the purpose. She had decided I was. She told Grace this in Cebuano in the kitchen while I was in the main room talking to Grace's brother Nonoy, and Grace told me afterward, and the telling of it by Grace had the quality of someone passing on a verdict that matters more than the passing on can fully convey. The wedding was in November. The church was old and beautiful, and the priest had the voice of someone who had been doing this for 40 years, and who understood that the ceremony required both the formal weight of the ritual and the human warmth of two specific people standing in front of it, and who managed both simultaneously with the skill of someone who had married 400 couples and who had found, through repetition, the way to make the ritual feel personal without diminishing the ritual. Nane Beth sat in the front pew with her rosary and her best dress, and the expression of a woman attending the culmination of something she had been working toward, not in the controlling way of mothers who manage their children's lives, in the investing way of mothers who have put everything into the person standing at the altar, and who are watching the return on 40 years of that investment, with the specific emotion of someone who has been proved right about something they were always confident about, but that required the outcome to confirm. I was moved by the expression. I want to say that. Standing at the altar waiting for grace, I looked at Nane Beth in the front pew, and I felt, in the way that emotion arrives when you are not defending against it, the full weight of what I was being given access to. Not just grace, the front pew, the 40 years of cooking and raising and investing. The woman with the rosary who had been the center of the kitchen that produced the woman I was marrying. I was moved. I should have paid closer attention to what the moving was telling me. 6 weeks after the wedding, Nane Beth arrived on a Wednesday morning with 2 bags. Let me tell you what 6 weeks of marriage had looked like before the Wednesday, so that you understand the Wednesday in its full context, because a history teacher always tells you the context. The house was mine. I want to say that clearly, because the possessive matters to the rest of the story. I had rented it for a year before the wedding, and had bought it after the wedding at a price that the exchange rate made possible, and that my pension and savings made achievable. A concrete house in a residential area of Cebu City, with 3 bedrooms and a garden, and a kitchen that was larger than standard, and that I had made larger still during the renovation, because I understood by then that in a Filipino household, the kitchen is load-bearing and should be treated as such. The 3 bedrooms, ours, mine, and Grace's, Jasmine's, and the room I had thought of as a guest room, which I had furnished with the specific minimal furnishing of a room that was not expected to be used regularly, but that needed to be ready if used. A bed, a small dresser, a window, curtains, a ceiling fan. The guest room logic of a man who had lived alone for 19 years, since the divorce, and who had 1 guest room in Portland that Marcus used when he visited twice a year, and that otherwise sat clean and minimal and available and unoccupied. That room, the guest room, 6 weeks into the marriage. The marriage itself was good. I want to say that before I tell you the Wednesday, because the Wednesday needs to be understood in the context of a marriage that was working, that had the daily texture of two people who had chosen each other carefully and who were finding, in the early weeks, that the choosing held up under the close examination that cohabitation provides. Grace cooked in the large kitchen, and I assisted with the specific assistance of a man who has been taught to assist by a woman who has standards for assistance, and who does not lower the standards for the sake of the assistance being easier to provide. Jasmine did her homework at the kitchen table, with the phone-assisted efficiency of a teenager navigating the modern homework landscape, and narrated her social life to both of us in the continuous broadcast that adolescents produce when they feel comfortable in a space. We ate dinner together every night. We walked on Sunday mornings in the neighborhood before the heat arrived. The days had a shape. The shape was good. 6 weeks in, Wednesday morning, I was on the porch with my coffee. Not the first coffee. The second, the slower one. The one I had after the morning's first administrative tasks were done, and that I drank sitting in the chair that faced the garden, where Grace's flowering plants were doing what they had been doing since she had moved them from her previous apartment in the month before the wedding, slowly establishing themselves in the new soil with the patience of living things that understand the establishing takes time. I heard the gate. I looked up. Nane Beth was coming through the gate with a bag in each hand and a plastic container under one arm, and the expression of a woman arriving somewhere she intends to be. I stood up. She saw me. She said, in the warm, direct way she addressed me, which was always warmer than her addressing of most people, and which I had taken as a compliment, and which I still take as a compliment. "Joe, good morning." I made humba, still warm. She walked past me into the house. I stood on the porch with my second coffee, looking at the open door through which Nane Beth had just passed, and I thought two things in rapid succession. The first was, where is Grace? The second was, what is happening? Grace appeared from the kitchen. She had known. I could see from her face that she had known. Not today specifically maybe, but soon. And today had turned out to be soon, and she had not told me. And the not telling me had its own explanation, that I was going to need to hear, and that she was going to need to tell me, and that we were going to need to find the right moment for. In a house that now contained Nane Beth and her humba, and her 2 bags, and the guest room that I now understood had never been a guest room in any operational sense. Grace said, "Joe,